Fantasy Animation is a completely free, online, educational resource dedicated to examining the relationship between fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. It is staffed by a volunteer army of academics and animators who give up their time to run the website so that our audience can be kept informed not just about the latest goings-on in the world of all things that are drawn, imagined and sculpted, but to help inform them about the historical, political, ethical and aesthetic ramifications of what it means to make an animated fantasy. Check out our weekly blog posts, containing insights on everything from the sexual identity of SpongeBob SquarePants to how to make an animation on a pair of knickers. You can also access our archive of podcasts featuring Oscar-winning VFX supervisors, historians, classicists, animators and folklorists discussing their favourite examples of fantasy animation. To find out more, visit us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Reddit at FanAnimResearch, FANANIM Research, or visit fantasy-animation.org. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. My magical power this week is that I am Alex Sargent.
And I am the quotidian Chris Holliday.
Quotidian, realism, magic, all these things and more to come in this very special episode on Encanto, the potentially Oscar-winning Disney feature. We don't know yet. We're recording before Oscar night, but you're listening to this post-Oscar night, so you're in better knowledge than we are about that. But certainly a big hit for the studio, a sort of post-COVID hit for the studio. We don't talk about Bruno is now apparently the best Disney song ever written. There's lots to talk about on the episode. As a fantasy scholar and theorist, I'm going to talk about the thorny problem of fantasy representation in other cultures when fantasy is so much tied to the Western context. We've mentioned this on the podcast before. We're going to mention magical realism, even if we are to mention it just to explain how this film isn't it. Yeah. But we'd like to do that on the podcast a lot. One of these days we should do an episode on it where something that is magical realism, but right now it isn't going to be this episode. We can talk about spectacle, we can talk about the role of family, lots to talk about and more. How about you, Chris? Anything to talk about in terms of animation this week?
Yes, so it's a computer animated film, so my interest was piqued almost immediately. I would say this is the best sequel to Coco we've ever had, so that's pleasing. I have things to say about sentient houses in animation that have a kind of history in animation. I'm really interested in the use of music in the film, kind of going back in some recent work, looking at the musical numbers of the Renaissance period. Was struck here by the musical numbers that seem to take place in a particular kind of narrative space. And also, if we get a chance to talk about kind of gender, this idea of a film that's about what it means to carry the weight, a film about being good enough, and tying that in, hopefully, to a Latin American history to which I am certainly a novice, so I'm really pleased that we've got our guest for this week.
Yeah, and I should introduce our guest now, who's going to help us think our way through this movie. Dolores Tierney. Dolores is head of film and professor at the University of Sussex, and she's published widely on Latin America and Latinx film and media in a variety of different academic anthologies and journals. She is also the author of Emilio Fernandez and New Transnationalisms in Contemporary Latin American Cinemas, and the co-editor of Laxploitation Cinema and Latin America, as well as with Deborah Shaw and Ann Davis, the transnational fantasies of Guillermo del Toro. So, Dolores, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
No, thanks for coming on the show. So, yes, Encanto is the word of the season. We all know the songs, we all know the film, and by now people will know whether it won the Oscar or not, but we are currently none the wiser. Can you give us a little bit of a flavour as to what your first thoughts were when you heard about the movie? It's obviously kind of overlaps with some of your research interests in Latin American representation. So what were some of your sort of initial thoughts or concerns or hopes for the film when you first heard that it was being produced and commissioned?
Well, always happiness if there's representation of groups that are often otherwise marginalized. So any Latin American representation is something I'm going to welcome and be happy about. And if I know that there are musicians involved who are Colombian and potentially also Latinx, then there's a point at which there's a welcoming of an excitement to see the film. So I was excited to see the film with my daughters. And just happy, really. I mean, and I'll talk a bit more about why Latinx Colombian crossover is not as problematic as it might sound, although it would be if you were homogenizing them. Because with music, there's a kind of a border crossing thing that's much more possible.
Okay, cool. All right, well, we'll come to that. So I'm sensing from your answer there is a certain amount of hesitation going on as well, in that I suspect also when you've got a big studio like Disney coming across a culture that is not necessarily theirs or is trying to represent, there is also a certain trepidation one enters into. So what were the concerns about Encanto perhaps coming into it?
Okay, so, you kind of asked me to think a little bit about, Disney being on this kind of role of progressive representations to their previous back catalogue, that are things that are now outside the WASP experience. So they're trying not to do Pocahontas 3 or 4 and as badly as they did Pocahontas. So they've had Coco, which was great. They've had Moana, which was great too, in certain ways. Okay, so Coco was great because, Disney's often classed with misrepresenting non-Anglo cultures, and not just misrepresenting them, but demonizing them, belittling them, marginalizing them, etc. But Coco was actually a surprisingly authentic depiction of Mexico, really popular in Mexico and amongst Mexican Americans in the United States too, right? And it had all these kind of elements of cultural authenticity, like the alebrijes. It had, which is like the spirit animals, the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, the ofrenda, which is where families put bits of their offerings to their dead relatives. All those things were really authentic. And that's largely because it had, a Mexican-American producer or co-director, Adrián Molina. It had a kind of cultural consultant, Lalo Alcaraz, who's a Chicano cartoonist, and Chicano means Mexican-American. And it also came at a time, 2017, when everyone was kind of launched into the presidency of a new president who was kind of very much maligning Mexicans. And this was a really positive representation. So that was great. For me, who's into classical Mexican cinema, like the whole story focuses around this kind of nostalgia and love for that era, the songs of the classical Mexican cinema, the stars of the classical Mexican cinema, and how they continue to be popular in the present day. And that's all my work, really. And so that's the whole story, and Coco was great for those reasons. I mean, still some things, they did mix up some of the culturally authentic bits and took a few liberties, but hey, in the grand scheme of things, and this is important, Mexican Americans and Mexicans were happy with it. And it was seen overall as an achievement, and it did very well at the box office. So not to be too cynical, but I think Disney are still mining this. They're like, the Latinx population in the US loves it. And there's a whole of Latin America, which is a massive film market. Sure. Let's just do more of that. And Moana 2 was actually really great too. So I won't go into Moana because that's not my field, but it had Polynesian musicians writing the music. Lin-Manuel Miranda also writes a song or two. You've got Dwayne Johnson in it, who's part Samoan. So there was a kind of like a representation and a homage to Polynesian myths. So yay. And in the line of that, I was expecting maybe more from Encanto than I got.
It sets up a lot of things that I'm interested in relation to computer animation. So trying to situate what you've said in relation to where this film might fit within a broader shift within what I would call the computer animated film genre that was happening around 2017, 2018. And I think you've gestured to Trump, but also another film that we've done on the podcast, Spider-Verse, where a lot of my work is about the generic uniformity of computer animated films. And when a film like Coco or when a film like Spider-Verse comes along and you feel like there's something different happening, it was both great and terrible for me for kind of a couple of reasons. One is, well, it sort of derails my whole point about the question of generic strict uniformity. But on the flip side, it also confirms that what had come before was at least generic. And now we've got something that's kind of doing things that are slightly different. So you mentioned Moana, and I mean, I'd also add to that Pixar's upcoming Turning Red, Disney's Raya and the Last Dragon, because we might want to lump Disney and Pixar in together, and their industrial relationship is very, very close. But there is a sense in which Pixar have made Coco, and that has tapped into something that Disney are also very keen to then tap into, which leads us down the road to Encanto. But I think there's a lot, contemporary Pixar and contemporary Disney have sort of, Pixar especially have got a little bit of a bad rep for lapsing into sequels and pushing against kind of original stories. And actually, it seems to be Disney that are the new Pixar in terms of maybe what they're trying to do and as you say, move towards different kinds of cultures. But as you say, there's also that issue of, you mentioned authenticity. And one of the notes I had on the film was it didn't feel Encanto like it was set dressing as much as it perhaps could have been. And there's always a rhetoric, I think, of authenticity when Disney and Pixar and any animation studio, particularly in Hollywood, are making these kinds of movies. There's often a special feature on the DVD that says, but we also went there and did some research, and we also did go to Polynesia for a while, and we also flew to Colombia, and you get the same kind of rhetoric of authenticity that sometimes does jar with the images on screen. But I did feel with Encanto that there was something authentic about the film, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But yeah, it seems like it was trying to do something there wasn't a sense of Orientalist kind of viewing of the world. There wasn't that idea of kind of outsiderdom. It was within a culture and embracing it right from the start, and we were off. And that I found was really, really kind of positive in that sense.
Well, the thing is, it's also a Disney film, and it's very familiarly a Disney film. So there is that point at which we can feel, already within it. So I think what it's done is it's taken some of the generic elements that I think you did ask me to think about, like family and stuff.
Yeah.
It does has a Latina producer. She's not necessarily Colombian, but it does have some Colombian musical styles and singers singing, specifically. And it attempts to represent elements of Colombian topography, which is, lots of different kinds. You've got Andes in Colombia, you've got kind of Amazonian jungle, you've got coast, you've got kind of very lush semi-tropical forests, which I think it's the Choco. I think that's partly where this is. You've got kind of, a million different kinds of, Colombia itself is a really varied country, very racially diverse as well. So a lot of those things were kind of squashed in here, and there were aspects of the architecture of kind of like maybe a Paisa house or a kind of a colonial style Latin American house. So these are things that are recognizable if you were looking as a tourist at Latin America too. So it can be both familiar and yet also problematic, when you're kind of grappling with some of the things it does, to Colombia, with a representation that seems familiar only because it is feeding off several cliches and received ideas about it, in that kind of a way. Full disclosure, I'm not a Colombianist. I'm a Latin American film specialist who's mostly worked on Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Cuba. But I have spent a year in Colombia when I was 2021. So that's a while ago now, right? And I've read a lot of Colombian literature and seen a whole bunch of Colombian films. So I teach Colombian cinema as part of what I teach, but I've never gone there to research Colombian cinema, as my thing.
That puts you a lot of quite a few grades above both Chris and I. So I'm glad you're here to provide at least some context to this. I wanted to talking about that kind of balancing act between trying to make a film that is familiar to its kind of, basic, I guess, core audience that's been there since the start of the Disney studio. It's sort of, white Anglo-Saxon mainstream appeal, whilst also being culturally sensitive. And that's obviously an impossible balancing act to an extent, in that the more specific you get, the less universal you get, or somewhere in between the two. I guess the role of family becomes a really interesting thing to think about with this, because I was struck watching the movie. I liked the movie quite a bit, but I didn't love it. And one of the things I didn't love about it was that the thematic of family seemed to me almost a sort of prison for the movie, in that I was trying to work out what one of the things that these films seem to be doing is offering a kind of new gendered vision of Disney femininity, and that involves taking away the handsome prince, taking away a sort of male-dominated agency, and allowing female characters to have female-oriented goals. Moana does the same, but what they seem to be, there doesn't seem to be at the moment a way of doing that narrative within the Disney stable that doesn't then insist on family as the next important thing. It's like
because Moana and Coco, it was all about their family.
All about family, right? So I wondered if you could talk about that in the film, because on one hand, I think that family is so Disney, and what is more Disney than insisting on the importance of family? But on the other hand, there is certain nuances to this family in that it's a very intergenerational family. There is a certain aspect of this family that I could believe spoke more specifically to its context. So I don't know, did that strike you as a thing the film was trying to work through at all, and where did you sit on it?
Well, one of the things that when I sit with my daughters and we watch movies, they're like, please be quiet, mum, because I ruin almost every film for them. But I was quite quiet, but at the end, one of the things, it's more kind of a Marxist kind of point, that the film seemed to be about one family having some kind of feudal privilege that had been given to them by a candle, miraculously. And in that sense, that's very much the old-fashioned melodrama, telenovela kind of thing. Poor characters only become rich by chance. It's very much a thing that, if we could think about melodrama as inherently Latin American, coming through from its serial novels through to telenovelas, which is like Latin American soap operas, but they're different. That kind of chance arrival of wealth is something that kind of struck me as quite telenovela-like. But then the kind of feudal privilege of that family and the whole village looking up to them, and the worry about that privilege disappearing. I didn't care if their privilege disappeared. as an academic looking at it through a kind of a Marxist structural lens. And so for me, I didn't like Encanto. And at the end, my kids were like, yeah, maybe that was it. We didn't really care. Because it's like, well, why do you get to live in the big house? That still doesn't seem fair. And everyone suffered the violence that was kind of nebulously referred to. So la violencia was a thing that kind of broke out late 40s through the 50s. So it's kind of this massively violent period in Colombia that went on for maybe 20 or 30 years. Gabriel Garcia Marquez kind of refers to it at the edges of his novels. And that's kind of what we think is being gestured to, that kills the grandfather.
Yeah. Sure.
That means the family then needs something. I hope I'm not giving away the story. And then the candle arrives, which gives them the magic. Mm-hmm. So on that level, the family itself isn't something I was rooting for in your average way. I was rooting for Coco's family, or I was rooting who are proletariat working class, who are just getting by. And who were worried about music as a threat. So that was kind of, I don't know why I went there, but that was my analysis. The narrative arc didn't work for me because I was just like, well, why do you get to have the big house?
Yeah. No, it's a good point, because
I don't care.
In a way, the film wants to do community, doesn't it? It wants to have that kind of end shot where the community rebuilds the house and they're all working together. And it also wants to use the family to talk about individuality and, everyone can be themselves and all that sort of stuff. But all of it is rooted in this, yes, as long as this family gets to stay kind of in charge, right? And that the use of magic as a kind of justification for that. It hadn't struck me, but yeah, you're quite right. I
was so outraged by it. And the more I talk about it, the more outraged I am. So I'm saying that's why Encanto, oh, yay, look, positive representation of a Latin American country, some accuracies, quite a few accuracies, not that many. I'm going to shout out to Maria Elena Cepeda, Angarad, Valdivia, and Diana Leon's boys, who are three great Colombianists who could most probably eviscerate this movie much better than I could, Okay. But that, for me, the family...
Eviscerate it a bit for us.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right, So I told you I'm not a Colombianist, but I am an undergraduate Latin Americanist, right? So I read my kind of canonical Latin American literature, Spanish literature, whatever. And then I ended up in film in my MA. So when I saw it and I saw the yellow butterflies and I saw the family, I'm like, wait a minute, this film it's called Encanto. And Nancy's like, what does Encanto? My daughters are doing Spanish. And they're like, Encanto can mean enchantment. But then I'm like, wait a minute, it means magic. And I'm like, oh no. Right. So you asked me about magical realism. And I think the film wants to actively invoke magical realism, right? Or an idea of what the filmmakers think it is, because they see that as Latin American and indeed specifically Colombian, right? So, I've read reviews that have talked about Guillermo del Toro as a magical realist director. And I want to tear my hair out, okay? Because in his big novel, 100 Years of Solitude, which is one of those books that everyone says they've read in English, but they haven't, but they might have done, right? You've got a familia, the Buendia family, and they're a big family that go on for generations and generations. So tick, Encanto seems to fit that one. And then you've also got yellow butterflies, which happen. They kind of follow a character around in 100 Years of Solitude. I want to say Aureliano Buendia, but I might be wrong, right? So I'm like, oh, yes, yellow butterflies and that. Okay. But then this isn't magical realism because, and this is something, Chris, you can maybe help with. You were talking a bit about the Disney Register, right?
Yeah.
And in the Disney Register, everything is fantastical and everything is exaggerated. Animals are anthropomorphized, things happen, and we accept that as normal because we are socialized to watch Disney in a certain way. Yeah, animals talk, things happen, right? So the realist register is really hard for us to find. But magical realism isn't just about magic, it's about magical realism. So you have to have realism. So really, you'd have to have a cartoon that was trying to replicate one of those realist Latin American directors like Fernando Aimque or Carlos Reigadas. I don't know if you've seen any of them, but they make these very slow, quotidian, realist films, right? Or Alonso from Argentina, where people are just going about their daily business, chopping down a tree takes as long to chop down a tree as it would take to chop down a tree on film. So for something to be magical realist, and I wrote this down, you have to have the matter-of-fact everyday register as the dominant.
Right.
And then the magic has to kind of break into it and just be accepted by everyone as normal. Oh yeah, here he comes with his yellow roses. But from the beginning of Encanto, you're like, tell us about the magic of your family. What's so great about your family? Oh, look, he's got a gift. And it's all crazy and accepted as magic and exaggerated. And when Antonio comes to be able to listen to animals, you're like, because already in Disney, animals talk anyway. So there's a level at which there's no quotidian. I'm trying to hope I'm explaining it to you well.
No. This is really it made what you were saying, Dolores, made sense insofar as I was writing. There was something about the film that didn't quite work for me, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so some of the things, just bouncing off of some of the things that you said, I think you're right that there's something. I think this goes back to this issue of the family and the absence of complete family structures historically within Disney and even into Pixar's films, and now I would also say DreamWorks and lots of other contemporary studios. They like an incomplete family because what it allows them to do is to play with broader issues of surrogacy and friends as family, and actually your family are the community and all this kind of stuff. But there has been a shift, as Alex was saying, towards the importance of actually family and thinking about who in Coco, who your real father is, and who. And in Encanto, that this very complex, and there are lots of moving parts to this family, just as there's lots of moving parts to this house in the film. But I was trying to kind of get my head around how all these bits fitted together, and in certain terms of some of the characters, I thought they looked great, and as a family, I believed lots of the relationships, but that then prevents the filmmakers to be able to play with that idea of sort of surrogacy, and it does something new with the question of family. But then you're right that it prioritizes and makes exceptional this particular family as the bearer of the film's magical realist qualities, without really identifying, as you said, the everyday matter of the normality upon which or into which the magic intrudes.
But that's not magical realism. I don't know if they are selling it as magical realism.
I think they are.
That's not magical realism. I know they have. They've done the family dynasty and they've done the yellow butterflies, and I'm like, that's not magical realism. That's not magical realism, and it made me quite annoyed. So
it's because for Disney magic isn't a discourse; it's a spectacle, isn't it? When they say come to Fantasyland isn't a way of interrogating the world. It's a way of enjoying a ride, so, and that's what magic
fantasy is
has
different to magical realism, isn't it, Alex?
Sorry?
wouldn't you argue that fantasy is different to magical realism?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm having an echo. We had Felicity Guy on the podcast a few months ago, and we had exactly this debate between magical realism and fantasy. And it's very difficult to find any example of mainstream animation or any kind of popular story that really does offer a nice example of magical realism.
But I think that's what I think there was a mistake in some meeting somewhere where no one had read 100 Years of Solitude, which shows that everyone should read it, right?
Sure. Guillermo del Toro thing. I mean, what people think magical realism means is a fantasy story with an element of I don't know, allegorical weight to it. That seems to be what most people mean by and that isn't what it is, but that is what it sort of has become in popular parlance. So it seems to mean that, I'm sure if you asked a Disney animator this, they would say, well, we were aiming at the emotional truth of it all and all that kind of stuff, which, fine. But that isn't what this film's doing. So it's certainly not engaging in that register of magical realism. There's
no realism for magic to break into. Does that make that sort of?
And by magic, we mean spectacle. We mean big, shiny.
It's all spectacle.
Sure.
You couldn't even look like, say, songs versus narrative. There's no point at which mundanity or everyday qualities exist in Encanto. Magic house made for them by a magic candle.
Yeah. Well, actually, that brings me to a couple. I suppose I was expecting towards the end of the film so it reminded me of that. There's a Simpsons episode where, I think it's Family Guy, but they basically rebuild. Oh no, I think it's the Simpsons where they rebuild Ned Flanders' house. Like the community comes together and builds the house, and it's like terrible. And they do a similar joke in Family Guy where they have this kind of montage of the main characters coming together and redecorating a pub, and then they just turn it into a mess, and they go, we had no training for this and we really shouldn't have done this. There was something
all those TV makeover shows, isn't it?
Yeah.
Radical home makeover or whatever that they have.
But I thought so when the community towards the end kind of comes together and rebuilds the house, I thought it was going to be rebuilt without the magic, and the point was that the magic doesn't come from this otherworldly space. It kind of comes from the community, and that then kind of
could have
elevated
the movie,
yeah, but also reduces their exceptionality. But actually, what the film then does at the end is reinstates their exceptionality by reintegrating magic into the world. I mean, and also you mentioned music very briefly. I thought that the lack of the sort of quotidian and the normality, the lack of normality was evident in the musical numbers. I think all of the musical numbers, apart from the last two, which occur after the kind of house has kind of disintegrated and the house has kind of crumbled. All of the musical numbers up to that point occur in this strange abstract space, which Disney has done previously, but only intermittently. So it did it a lot in Aladdin, where the genie's friend like me.
Because of the genie,
Because of the genie. And it happens in The Princess and the Frog, where a couple of the musical numbers are done against the backdrop of the mythical, and because of that, you get these really abstract geometric non-spaces.
Don't you think it's kind of internal? I think this is internal colonialism. So to go a bit further with the magical realism and apply it, I think it's really colonialist to call a nation magic and therefore okay and not in need of structural help or fairness or anything. It's kind of those magical solutions in magical realism. It's a really political novel that's all 100 Years of Solitude is a really political novel that's acknowledging the damage that colonialism and the United Fruit Company has done to Colombia, including massacres and things like that, so it's really aware of all those things. And to just blanket kind of apply magical realism uncritically to a country or to the Louisiana swamp in Princess and the Frog is because Louisiana itself is sometimes seen as this kind of internal other, this kind of underdeveloped space within the US, French and slightly different, and maybe a bit Northern Caribbean, and and the Katrina kind of backlash against people who got flooded out of their homes or killed was like, well, they shouldn't have lived there, it's their fault for being underdeveloped. We'll just deny that's even part of the US. I think that's what's going on with some of those abstractions and moves into kind of non-real space. I think it's rooted in a kind of a colonialist perspective that Coco didn't have, and I think I feel it is more an outside look at Colombia, mainly because they miss, misuse and misapply magical realism so badly. And I think that point you've made about the abstract space, I hadn't thought about it till you started to talk about the musical numbers kind of going out of what, even though it's not that real, it's real enough in terms of the film. Yeah. You know, suddenly she's in a Colosseum, Luisa, when she's doing her number, and you know, you're right. And they go suddenly there. Yeah, it's not even a physical space.
Yeah, and the musical numbers up to the point where the house is destroyed, because it occurs in this abstract space, it kind of really makes the most of animations, I suppose, metaphorical or a symbolic function. It sort of visualizes the lyrics and does as part of animation's medium specificity, let's say, it revels in transformation and metamorphosis and that kind of culture of quick change by taking these characters and placing them in lots and lots of different settings. The two musical numbers after the house is disintegrated, I think, are the only two where the music and the songs take place in the diegetic space, because they're about the building of the rebuilding of the world. And I was really struck by the bombardment, or the visual bombardment, of all these colours, and I suppose what I know David Baldwell, when he talks about these computer animated films, talks about a mise en scène that is overstuffed. Everything was overstuffed, and then the last two musical numbers, as part that were part or folded into the narrative of reconstruction as the house is rebuilt, seemed to be of a different visual order or a different register. And I thought, based on what you were saying, I thought that was a really. And this goes back to maybe the fantasy or the magical realist element that I was thinking, is this film...
Not calling it the magical realist element, because we've acknowledged that it's not. It's what they think is magical realism.
Exactly, yeah. A sort of... an imagined view of magical realism based
realism
on...
land.
Yeah.
So there is that kind of... You know, there's a point at which, you know, Latin America was often tropicalized and made into this kind of space in the 40s, which was all about the good neighbor and la la la. And we get Carmen Miranda, who would be any Latin nationality you needed her to be, you know. And there's a point at which this movie almost does that. There's a level at which, yes, Lin-Manuel Miranda gets his musical styles quite right. You know, he does get cumbia and vallenato, which are two Colombian modes. He gets Carlos Vives to sing, and he is a big Colombian star. He sings the vallenato, you know, and it's like, oh, and it's all a big party, and it's got the accordion music. Do you remember that? That's the very specifically Colombian music. That's me playing an accordion.
Yeah.
Right, so
listeners are missing a treat, but yeah.
I'm minding, but you know, there's a point at which there's a homogenization, which is slightly problematic of that magical space down there that's Latin America, that for me feels regressive rather than progressive about Latin America. But on another level, people might say, well, it's not violent, so, you know, la la la, it's a little bit more positive. But there can be problems in a positive representation too.
That's really interesting, because I was thinking about kind of colonialist discourses that have often weighed down these kinds of animated films where they are engaging with the other, and also this comes out of a challenge in the classroom to try and teach certain kinds of cartoons on this basis. So thinking about colonialist discourses, I suppose, objectively or box ticking wise, you could say, well, we could say that it avoids, in terms of tropes of empire, animalization, infantilization, space and light and dark. It doesn't try and this isn't an other that is irrational and peripheral and chaotic, but actually it seems from what you're saying that the use of fantasy and the attribution of fantasy under the guise of magical realism to this community is part of its colonialist discourse. It
can be problematic because it's not rooting it in a real, and it's also just taking something that's so kind of inherently Colombian and misapplying it in a kind of a sad way that makes you feel like, oh, that seems quite cynical to take the flowers. I feel like they did so well with Coco, where they did their homework, that they just kind of jumped into Encanto with doing less homework. Lin-Manuel Miranda, who is flawless in my opinion, wrote some great songs, okay, and he has, you know, all these great, he's got Sebastián Yatra, who sings Dos Oruguitas, which is nominated for the Oscars.
Sure.
You know, these two Colombian singers, you've got Maluma in it, you've got John Leguizamo, you've got Maria Cecilia Bolero, who plays the granny. John Leguizamo is Bruno, you know. All these songs have also been done in Spanish as well. So, you know, the song is ready-made for the Latin American, this movie is ready-made for the Latin American market. You know, it's already there, and it's already great for the Latinx market. And the other music that we have in there, like the salsa, which is more urban US Latinx, and other kinds of musical styles, this isn't part of the colonialism, the fact that there's lots of different musical styles, because Latin American rhythms, although they might be bounded in national identities like the vallenato and the cumbia, they do cross borders, and people dance to salsa in Colombia and people play vallenato in the States, and reggaeton is in it as well. You know, the song that Luisa does that you were talking about feeling pressure and all the donkeys kind of dance around her, that's her reggaeton. You know, those are good things. I don't want to kind of I feel like I've been eviscerating too much. I just want to quickly get in some nice things.
Well, and I guess that comes back to there's what the film is saying and what the film is doing, and the affective register versus the kind of thematic register aren't always the same thing. And often we can find a lot of positives in popular culture, or at least, slightly more progressive potential in popular culture if one focuses on the affective rather than the narrative. Because actually, I get the sense that those things are the things that are resonating with audiences. Well, it seems to be, at least by the success of the
representation is resonating. So in the same way that West Side Story by Steven Spielberg has resonated well, Encanto's resonated well in that it's showing Afro-Colombians, and it's showing more indigenous looking Colombians, and it's showing European looking Colombians, and it's kind of acknowledging their diversity. And West Side Story was, a properly Latinx based cast, and not Greek actors with brown face on, as in the original. Okay, but it's still by a white director, and a lot of Puerto Ricans were like, why the hell remake it? Why can't we make our own movie that's about something else rather than remake this kind of cherished icon? And that's a really valid point too. So the positives are representation of previously marginalized groups. But potentially, why can't they tell their own story? So Lin-Manuel is telling a story.
Yeah.
Potentially, we need more Adrián Molinas. I don't know what he was doing while Encanto was being made, but he might have been also pulling his hair out. I'm not sure. Maybe he was just I've had my glory, I'm just going to sit back. I'm not sure how Disney works. I don't think they kind of...
It seems that there's this kind of, there's this new production model of these cultural consultants they sort of get in, don't they? And I worry about that because it's very much egged up in the marketing, right? If they don't worry, we've done our homework. We've got a bunch of local historians to tell us that this is the thing we should be doing, and all this kind of stuff. And that speaks to me of some sort of, colonial power structures.
But it
also seems to me, ultimately the Rubicon they won't cross is that let the writers and directors just be Colombian. Apparently that isn't what you need to do. What you need to do is establish a whole infrastructure so the white men don't do
the wrong things. Don't do racism. We're going to teach you how not to do it.
So we're going to have 5 people over there tell you, just checking that you're not being racist at any point, but rather than just let them do it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And West Side Story did have a lot of Puerto Rican. It had academics, because I know one, and they were all asked to sign NDAs, and they did all kind of get together. And West Side Story doesn't have some of the dodgy lyrics, about this island, all the hurricanes blowing, and all about the population. It got rid of some of those primitivist and colonialist stereotypes about Puerto Rico, and it made the story less unequal. So that the Jets and the Sharks were more, and the Sharks weren't portrayed as kind of dark and savage and shark-like. They were more, and the Jets themselves were proper hungry and dispossessed rather than just kind of white and blonde and a bit athletic. There was a greater sense of equality. Or that West Side Story still had some problems, but it was better. And the Puerto Ricans weren't dancing on a roof; they were in the street, and there was Latin-owned businesses, and it was a better representation. So well done. There's a lot more to say about that, but I do think the consultant thing. Well, Lala Alcaraz on Coco seemed to do really well, but you also had Adrián Molina and various other people. So, and the songwriters, I think one of the songwriters is Latinx for Coco, but not both. I think they're a songwriting team. The husband's Anglo or US.
Is the other Final Frontier language? Briefly, also, if you're going to tell a Colombian story, does it have to be in the English language? The answer is commercially yes, or at least I expect that's what Disney think. But is that a problem, or is that something that we can kind of swallow?
I would imagine that dubbed versions are already circulating in Latin America, because it's much easier to dub a cartoon, isn't it? And there were, not dubbed, I mean, like and it doesn't have to be dubs, were there? You know, they've got different actors doing it. And that's been happening for a long time at Disney. You know, that Disney, it's much easier. I know the Ukrainian president did, I can't remember, but he like
Paddington.
What?
Paddington.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So there's a point at which that's, you know, Disney's been doing that for a long time. So it's almost like the Joinville studios that existed in Paris in the 30s, or Hollywood's Spanish language and German and French language versions that all happened at the coming of sound. This has all been made possible again, right? So this is already happening. But, you know, the Encanto we saw was kind of sprinkled with a bit of Spanish. Some of the songs were completely Spanish. Carlos Vives sang in Spanish. Sebastián Yatra sang in Spanish. You know, in the movie that I saw on, I can't remember, we bought it. I think we must have bought it on Amazon. I'm sure, I don't know. Do you remember what you saw or experienced?
I watched mine on Disney Plus.
Yeah, so did I.
There was some Spanish language.
Some songs, was there like a bit of dialogue and songs in Spanish, or?
There was some dialogue in Spanish, yeah. I was thinking, because the issue of dubbing is obviously a thorny issue in animation, and I could definitely go off on one, but I won't. But a lot of stars would dub themselves in other languages. So Antonio Banderas would dub Puss in Boots in multiple international versions of Shrek 2 or Shrek 3 or whatever. But that would give the impression that the US version was just one of many, and actually it's really important to have these actors that speak in their native language. That may cause a bit of jarring with regards to the sound image relations, but it's not uncommon for these films to be
they just do it on the cheap. They just go pretend you're speaking in Spanish.
Yep. But even you know, I know Lewis
Antonio Banderas would be able to do the Spanish version, of course. I'm just saying I have no idea how good is French or Italian or any other.
Well, so Lewis Hamilton, who plays a car in one of the Cars films, he dubbed himself in English, German, and French. So there's a whole kind of industry, and there are writers. Colin Montgomery is one who writes on the sort of vocal performances across national borders of Pixar and Disney films, and the way in which they are sold to local audiences, specifically through kind of dubbing practices. But it's also not uncommon for these films to literally be reanimated. So there are culturally specific elements to certain films that are replaced according to the country of release.
And they get it all wrong.
Well, so there's a good example is Inside Out, where I think there's a moment where Riley recoils because of a topping on a pizza. And that topping was changed depending on which country the film was shown in, because some foods are kind of considered... So in our case, I think in the US, UK, broccoli, but in other countries, it was like green peppers and jalapenos and things like this. So there are instances where films, and this goes back to Snow White, people have written on the different versions of Snow White because of anything with signage has to be reanimated in the local language and all these kinds of things. So dubbing is one part of that, and computer animated films have certainly made it easier and the process more flexible to do this kind of dubbing and to have stars voice animated characters years after they die. Paul Newman can appear several years after he dies in the third Cars because they have the sound files in an archive somewhere and they can cut it together. So I'm really interested in that kind of posthumous vocal performance. But it does, dubbing is part of that. And there are people more well-versed than me on the actual industrial structures of, we expect stars to sound a certain way, but and therefore, like, the Mexican Tom Cruise can only ever dub Tom Cruise films, and it would be weird if he was suddenly voicing Mr. Potato Head. And there are all these kind of local dubbing practices within animation that have that kind of
Really
really
they're going to do a franchise of several ones. Wow.
So I guess we should start thinking about wrapping up. I've got a couple of things on animated houses, but I just wondered, Alex, do you have any final thoughts? We've just been talking about magical realism. We've talked about the kind of cultural specificity of magical realism in relation to a potential Orientalist or colonialist gaze that seems to permeate the film. But with your fantasy hat on, there isn't magical realism. Anything to kind of talk about?
Well, I don't know. We sort of touched on it without being as explicit about it as we could have. I think the film isn't magical realist. I think we've made that quite clear. I think the film is interested in fantasy, and the way it uses fantasy is largely to kind of tell these stories of identity, so that it's what we might call in the fantasy theory trade a narcissistic fantasy, in that not because it's hugely indulgent and hubristic, but because it's about the self. Yeah, these are stories. As much as this is a story supposedly about family, it's fantasies about the self. Whether it be the sister with super strength who has to please everybody, the sister who's worried about exterior image and perfection. The way it evokes spectacle on screen through fantasy is to tell a series of kind of, or to offer a series of mediations around the human body, exterior identity versus interior identity, and all these kind of things. So in that ways, it is quintessentially Disney because it's a story about being yourself and the fantastical way in which one can do that. So, yeah.
Well, so I can't believe we've got to 90 odd episodes and you've just thrown in narcissistic fantasy for the first time. I'm now thinking about this in relation, because I suppose with my animation hat on, and then I will talk about animated houses, but with my animation hat on, this idea of kind of being yourself, the point is that the young, I suppose if the whole film is about the Madrigal family, the fact that Mirabel is herself, and the point is that herself, the film is all about the acquisition of fantasy through these series of powers, and her whole narrative trajectory is that she doesn't have the kinds of powers that are bestowed on other members of her family. And for a long time, the film shows us how she is not interested in being herself, and she wishes she wasn't herself. And actually, there's no real resolution to that because she still doesn't really gain magical powers in the same way. And so I think the film is a little bit ambivalent actually around its Disneyness in regards to what it means to be yourself, because for a large portion of the film, she isn't that interested in or finds the fact that she doesn't have magical powers a real weakness that she's trying to kind of constantly navigate in a family that is framed as highly exceptional.
Yeah, that's fair. I think what the film does though with the fantasies is it uses that not to display the self, but to enact the kind of tension within the self, and I guess in that way she has less of that because she hasn't got these sort of overt displays. I hadn't thought about the fact that actually, you were right. I was waiting for that moment where she's given the magical power, and the magical power is love or something like that. Yep. And that actually never comes. So that's a nice little almost nuance that the film kind of leaves in there. Go on then, Chris, talk to us about animated houses.
Well, I'm thinking about this. I may have shoehorned this or crowbarred into it in a previous episode, but one of my very first pieces of writing was on the anthropomorphism of houses across a cross-section of animated films, and it kind of begins with the shorts, earliest shorts in Europe, Emil Cole's Phantasmagoria, that has this house transform into an elephant at one point. Fast forward to Up, probably the best known example of an animated house. And one of the things I thought about when watching this film was, this is not a house that's going to metamorphose into the Carl Fredricksen's deceased wife Ellie. It always is and remains a house, and the way that he anthropomorphizes it is to project her humanity into it, and he talks to the house as if it was his wife. We've arrived, Ellie, and so forth. In this case, we have the magic almost going back to that early register of anthropomorphic houses by playing with the flexibility, that kind of plasmatic flexibility of houses, by having this actually take on a persona, if you like. So I thought that was a nice comparison between different ways in which sentience could be constructed through architecture. I would say early stuff, and even something like Monster House, where the house is literally the personification of a character's deceased wife. And then something like Up, where the house maintains, that's the word, it's kind of structural integrity. Its integrity as a house. And then you have this film Encanto, which is sort of caught between. It is personified, but still has enough form, houseness within its sort of anthropomorphic register. So I just thought that was an interesting way of...
It's personified and also kind of exoticized or something, isn't it? Like there are these cavernous spaces in the house that you're not quite sure whether they're supposed to be literal or metaphorical or this kind of thing. It reminds me a little bit of the children's picture book rather than the film of Where the Wild Things Are, where Max is sent to bed without supper and kind of goes to the land of the wild things. And it's always a little bit ambiguous whether what he's actually doing is just go into his wardrobe. Yes. So yeah, there is a certain kind of, I don't know, emotional energy to all that. It's interesting. I did think about Up. I did think that was a nice comparison to make. Yeah.
And just to go back to something that Dolores said, but also this idea of kind of magical realism land. I have since, before watching the film, I have since played a very small and free to download video game based on Encanto that has a series of levels through each of the doors. And it reminded me of some of the criticisms of Inside Out, which is set inside an 11-year-old girl's mind, but is equally also about the spectacle and destruction of a theme park, essentially. And there was something very, I don't want to say video game-esque about Encanto, but certainly I could see a lot of these different, behind each door, which is representative of each of the characters' magical powers, there was certainly something around this would make a great series of rooms at a theme park or levels on a video game. Sure. And I thought that maybe tied into some of the things that you were saying about the treatment of magic in relation to realism and the way that the film constructs an almost imaginary understanding of what it thinks magical realism is and how that might tie into a potentially slightly insidious commercialization of fantasy through this door we have this, and through this door we have this, and the kind of spatializing caught me off guard, really, because it reminded me of playing this video game where one completes different levels based on the individual character. But anyway, right. Yes. I guess we should wrap up.
Yes, Dolores, any final thoughts?
Well, I wanted to emphasize that, music and crossing borders is great, and I love the whole bits of that, but there's so many problems with the film, and the big thing is magical realism is not what they think it is, and that is most probably problematic to me, and also my feelings about the family and their privilege.
No, absolutely. Well, Doris, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being receptive to my evisceration, which wasn't really much of an evisceration. It was good to hear your perspectives, and I'll hear more from you when I hear you later. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dolores.
As always, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. You can also use that to email us, FANANIM Research at gmail.com. If there are some terms we've discussed on the podcast you'd like more discussion over, post-colonialism, magical realism, discourse, there's that word again, by all means, send us an email with the suggestions for a footnote episode, and we'll cover it in the in-between weeks on the show. And of course, you can also visit fantasy-animation.org for all our latest blog posts and our archive of podcasts. Check out our episodes on Coco and Moana, which were both mentioned on this show. But otherwise, that's been us for another episode. This episode was produced and edited by Leon Waldo, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.